Hi, and thank you for inviting me to speak to this symposium. I would like to talk to you today about how humans learn throughout the lifespan and how the brains reorganize and exhibit an incredible plasticity through training and through experience in life. So the question that we try to understand in our lab is how do we make sense of the world around us? This is something that we don't only do when we gaze at the stars on a beautiful night looking for galaxies and planets. This is something that we do in our everyday life when we try to navigate a new environment or learn a new language. So how does the brain do it? In my lab, we take a multidisciplinary approach to answer this question, and we combine human behavior with recordings of brain activity and also computational approaches for understanding these rich biological signals. We ask two main questions. One is how does the brain use previous knowledge to interpret the current scene, to interpret the environment and the input that we engage with at any given point. And the second question that we ask is how does the brain use previous knowledge from the past to predict the future. So I'd like to today give you some examples from our work trying to answer these questions. And I hope this will give you an idea about how the human brain learns and uses the past as a source of experience for dealing with the present and the future. So the first question we ask is how do we interpret the world around us? The brain has a huge challenge. The signals that we deal with, the input we deal with in our everyday experiences is cluttered, is busy, and it's noisy. If you are in natural scenes or in big cities, you always have this experience of a very busy input. So the classical theory suggests that the way the brain copes with these busy scenes is by decomposing them into simple features, something like little wavelets of information, and then trying to process the different features, for example, the position, the orientation, the color of a scene separately, and then put them back together to be able to interpret a complex scene like this picture, like this painting from Ilya Repin. It has been suggested that the brain during this process learns these features in a hierarchical manner. Early centers in the occipital cortex, where primarily visual input is analyzed, will compute very simple features like the position and the orientation of different features. And then as we move from the back of the brain towards more anterior in the brain, these features are combined into parts and into whole objects, into abstract categories, so that the brain can make sense of the world and assign meaning to different information. However, here we propose a different approach. We suggest that the brain doesn't simply decompose complex scenes into simple and more complex features, but the brain learns from experience what are the critical features to which one needs to pay attention in a scene, so that can quickly interpret the scene and understand the meaning and the intention depicted in a scene. How can we answer the question of whether the brain builds these behaviorally relevant, task-relevant structures is really a challenge. The way we approach this is by first creating a stimulus space that is unknown to participants in our study, so they don't have previous experience with, and to which we introduce quite a lot of noise so that the visual system is pressed to make difficult decisions. Then we create models that have all the information about the stimulus space, can make ideal decisions. We call this model ideal observers. And from these models, by interrogating their performance, we start understanding how potentially the human brain does it. We also collect behavioral responses, people's performance in specific tasks when they encounter these noisy stimuli, and their brain activity. And then what we do is we compare the human performance and the human brain activity to this ideal observer model so that we can understand how humans solve the same problems like machines that have all the information about the stimulus space. So to give you an example, consider this study. What we did here is we created a stimulus space and we introduced noise. These are unfamiliar stimuli. And we presented one stimulus at a time to our participants, and we asked them to tell us whether they look more like this stimulus or like this stimulus. As you can see, what we've done here through interpolation between the extremes of the stimulus space is we created a space that we could then, through feedback, assign the stimuli in two classes. For example, this class where the stimuli look more like this, or this class where the stimuli look more like this. We present the participants with this type of stimuli that have quite a lot of noise in terms of local arrangement of the dots, and the task is very difficult. What we see is that through training, the participants learn. We use an ideal observer model to decompose the space and test what information is used for solving this problem, for assigning stimuli to class A versus class B. And what you see here is that there are certain features where the two classes represented in red and blue differ maximally, for example, here, here, and here. So then we look into the human behavior, and by using a classification method, we try to identify from the behavior images that represent this critical feature space for making the decisions. As you can see, before training, we cannot rectify from the participants' performance these critical features that allow the model to separate the two stimulus classes. But after training, you see that these critical features start appearing, and the two classes represented in red and blue here can be separated. The classification method is based on assigning the participant responses in two classes, A and B, and then subtracting the stimuli corresponding to the participant responses in the two classes from each other, and that's how we collect these images. We then turn into the brain that we map while participants are performing this task in an MRI scanner. What you see here is the visual cortex, starting from the occipital pole in the primary visual cortex and extending anterior into more complex centers that analyze more complex visual information. Now, what we do in these areas is we extract in a higher, we extract the information that is processed in a hierarchical manner in these regions, and then we use a pattern classifier to extract information from the signals. This pattern classification is based on SVM machine learning approaches. So we train the classifiers with brain response from these different regions, and we test the classifiers and how well they can separate the stimuli that we presented the participants and the participant responses to class A versus class B. And what you see here is how the classifiers perform before training. We use the same classification approach when we analyze the response of the classifier. That is, we look at the classifier responses and we bin them for class A versus class B, and then we subtract the corresponding stimuli. And what you see in early visual cortex and in higher visual areas, we don't see any differences before training, and we don't see any of these critical features that are used for making the judgment, the classification judgment, appearing here. However, after training, what you see is that these features start appearing, these critical features for making a decision and separating the classes start appearing in higher visual areas, but not in early visual areas. We can quantify this by correlating the observed responses to the ideal responses. And here we take the distance between the stimulus classes, and you see that before training, there is no correspondence, while after training, we see a nice correlation emerging between what humans do and what our ideal observer model does, suggesting that humans start becoming more efficient in the classification tasks they perform. We do the same when we look at brain responses, and you see here that in early visual areas and in higher visual areas before training, the brain responses do not correspond to the ideal observer. But it's very clear that after training in higher visual areas, not in early visual areas, but in high visual areas, we see a nice correspondence between the ideal observer and the brain. Another interesting observation is that actually what we see is that the participants, as they become more efficient in making their judgments with training, they put more weight in the difficult features like this that vary less between the classes but are still very informative, and you see they weigh this information more for making their judgments, and we see the same reweighting of information in higher visual areas, not in early visual areas. So to summarize, what we see here is that when we have to make difficult judgments like categorizing abstract shapes with noise and learning abstract categories, individuals become more efficient in their decisions with training. Also, what training does is it changes the representations, it weights the representations in higher visual centers so that these more abstract categories can be represented. Now, in the second question that I wanted to address here is asks how the brain uses past experience not for solving a problem that it's faced with, but for predicting what will happen in the future. As Neil Bohr says, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So how does the brain do it? So we first look at how the brain predicts event streams. And to do this, we devised a paradigm where we use very simple stimuli-oriented gratings in this case. And these stimuli were presented in a sequence. So we used two orientations, left, right, and they were presented in a sequence. And after a while, this sequence stops. And what we ask the participants to do is predict which orientation will come up next, left or right. As you can see here, these were deterministic sequences we used. You see the participants learn nicely during training to perform this task and to predict the next stimulus in a sequence. We then looked in the visual cortex before and after training. We asked participants to perform the task in the scanner before and after training in the lab. And what you see here is the response to the sequence of stimuli. And then you see that this response decreases and it comes up at the test stimulus. The test stimulus is either a leftwards or a rightwards oriented grading, and the participants have to tell us whether this is what they expected or not. Now here, the interesting feature of our design is that between the sequence and the test stimulus, there was a long period of a gap. And we measured neural activity while there was no stimulus presented. And what you see as expected is when there's no stimulus presented to the visual cortex, the response goes down to baseline. You see there's no difference here before and after training when we have this long period of no stimulation. What we did then is we asked the question of whether actually there is any information here during this period that does not relate to the previous sequence presentation or to the testing news, but actually relates to the prediction that the participants are making. While the participants are experiencing the sequence of stimuli, then they are requested to make a prediction, and we ask whether there is any information we can extract from this prediction. So to answer this question, we took a pattern classifier and gave to the classifier the signal of the brain activity from this quiet period. And we asked the classifier to separate the activity related to a leftwards or a rightwards oriented grading. And this would be the activity related to the prediction of the participants. And what we see when we look at this is that after training, we have an increase in the classifier accuracy compared to before training, where classifier accuracy is at times in separating the prediction, the predicted orientation signal. So you can see this here when we look in primary visual cortex and in early visual areas. In general, what you see is that we have stronger classification accuracy. We can recover information related to the predicted orientation after training, but not before training. And this is not a case when we have a control task that requires just memorizing specific orientations rather than predicting as a control. So to summarize this first experiments tell us that actually the brain can keep information about the previous history of events and predict what will come up in the future. The work I showed you so far deals with simple events, sequential history. We then ask whether the brain can learn more complex sequences. And we were inspired to do this work by some seminal studies in infants that show that infants as young as 6 months old, they can actually extract temporal sequence from phonetic sequences. So in these experiments, infants were exposed to continuous speech, as you see here. And the interesting trick here is that there were some syllables and some sequences here of phonetic events that were more frequent than others. So for example, Toki-boo is more frequent than Boogie-ko. And what the researchers discovered was actually that infants were sensitive to these frequently presented sequences. So we asked whether the brain can learn more complex sequences that potentially may relate to learning structure about complex temporal events, like, for example, language. So to do this, we devised a complex sequence of symbols, and the participants experienced this sequence, and then they were presented with a display of 4 symbols and had to indicate with a button press which one of these 4 symbols was the one they expected. What we did here is we varied the probabilities of the individual symbols or pairs or triplets of symbols, and therefore this required the participants to try and learn the structure. We used an adaptive learning procedure where we started with level 0 sequences where one of the items were more frequent than others. Then we moved into level 1 where we had pairs that were more frequent than others, and then we moved to second order, level 2, where some triplets were more frequent than others. What you see here is that for all 3 levels, the participants could learn the sequences. In fact, they started always from level 0, and then when they learn level 0, they move to level 1 and then to level 2. We then built a model that learned from the participant responses and tried to extract information about how the participants learn these complex probabilistic structures. So the first thing that we interrogated with the model is how the participants learn the context length, how they learn how deep the structure is. And the second thing we interrogated is whether the participants learn the right contingencies or whether they learn the right pairs, for example, or triplets. And what we observed is that the participants learned, but at different rates. So as you see here, some participants extract information from these sequences faster than others. And we color-coded these through clustering analysis into red and blue so that you can see how we have effectively two classes of individuals. Although we have a continuum of responses, they can be clustered into faster learners and slower learners. And so we asked whether there was something in the decision strategies of these individuals that was different and potentially related to our speed in extracting this complex structure information. To test this, we built two models, a model of matching and maximization. These are well-known decision strategies that have been suggested to be adopted when participants make probabilistic decisions. So the matching strategy suggests that participants try to learn exactly the statistics of the scene. So if an event appears, if A appears more frequently than B, then they will select A more frequently than B. The maximization model suggests that participants will select an item or an event that is more frequently rewarded or more frequently appears. So if A appears 80% and B only 20%, participants will always select A to maximize their reward. Now, what is interesting here is that we did not give explicit feedback to the participants, so we did not reward them for their choices. They were exposed to these complex sequences and they learned without feedback. So there's no reward in this case. We then analyzed the data based on the participants' strategies. And what we see is that the red participants, the ones that are learning faster to extract abstraction, are the participants that started deviating from the matching line towards maximization, while the slower participants are the participants that seem to stick with a matching strategy and try to learn exactly the statistics of the sequence space. We then looked at the brain activation while participants perform this task. And in fact, we analyzed the data by including as a regression and analysis the strategy, the decision strategy that participants used. A negative decision strategy means that participants use more of a matching strategy. And what you see here is that we recover a network of areas that involves the hippocampus, basal ganglia, and visual cortex. This is known as the visual loop in reinforcement learning, and we see this visual loop here without explicit reward relating to a matching strategy. In contrast, when participants used more of the maximization strategy, what we see is a different network of areas being activated that involves frontal and subcortical regions. And this is known as the executive and motivational loop that supports goal-directed behavior. The results that I presented from this study suggest that human learners can extract complex structure and learn complex structure without explicit feedback, and they use different strategies, and matching strategies that relates more to visual cortico-striatal circuits versus maximization strategy that involves more frontal striatal circuits. How do we know that these circuits are actually connected? The work I showed you before looked at functional MRI activation. Here we pursued also connectivity analysis, both structural and functional connectivity analysis. And what you see here is on the structural connectivity analysis, we see the same visual loop involving hippocampus and basal ganglia relating to matching, while frontal striatal the loop relating to maximization. So to summarize then, what we have is two circuits, one involved in matching, which is a cortical-striatal circuit, and another involved in maximizing, which involves frontal striatal circuits. And these two different circuits supporting different learning strategies are really important because the brain can reorganize to choose one of the two, and that can be really important in, for example, cases of degeneration because of aging or brain damage. Looking at whether the brain can still learn in older age and use these circuits, we have tested older individuals over 75, and we see that they can still learn these complex tasks. And the same applies for individuals that suffer from mild cognitive impairment that is marked by impairment in memory primarily, and we see that these individuals can learn and extract information from these complex structures. And interestingly, what we see is that individuals with memory impairments, they use primarily these frontal striatal circuits compared to healthy controls that have the capacity to also use memory circuits. So to summarize, and I apologize about the technical problems, I hope I have given you some examples of how the human brain can use experience and learning to solve problems, interpret the current scene, but also the future from the past. And the next challenge for us is really to understand how the same learning can be used in artificial systems, how we can have both biological and artificial lifelong learners. And we are building models in the lab that allow us to understand the human brain, but also using what we learn about the human brain from neuroscience, from brain imaging, to build more humanized artificial systems. So I'd like to close by thanking everybody in my lab who has contributed to all of this work over the years, and also our funders. And thank you again for your attention, and look forward to your questions at the Q&A. Thank you.